I'm Dr. Sharna Olfman, and I would like to welcome you to the Science and Pseudoscience of Mental Health podcast for Mad in America. I am so pleased to be speaking with Dr. Kelly Brogan, who is a specialist in natural approaches to women's mental health. Dr. Brogan is a triple board certified MD who graduated from Weill Cornell Medical College, and she also has a degree in cognitive neuroscience from MIT. Dr. Brogan is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, A Mind of Your Own, The Truth About Depression, and How Women Can Heal Their Bodies and Reclaim Their Minds. And she is also co editor of the textbook Integrative Therapies for Depression. And you can connect with Dr. Brogan on her very extensive website, kellybroganmd.com. Dr. Brogan, welcome. And I want you to know that you are the absolute perfect guest for the Science and Pseudoscience of Mental Health podcast, because in your book, A Mind of Your Own, you address the pseudoscience of the chemical imbalance theory of mental illness. You address the pseudoscience of the alleged efficacy of psychiatric medication. In particular, you take on the SSRI antidepressants, but then you use rigorous science to introduce a really fresh understanding of the nature of mental health and how to prevent and treat mental health issues. And that's where I would like to start today. I'd like to start with a conversation about the science that is kind of at the heart um, of your approach to understanding mental health. And again, referencing your book, A Mind of Your Own, you speak a great deal about the role of inflammation, about the integrative nature or functioning of different bodily systems. In particular, you emphasize the gastrointestinal, the immune, the endocrine, and the nervous systems. Their conversations, in turn, with our internal ecosystem, the microbiome, and our external ecosystem, which unfortunately is increasingly toxic these days. So, if you could unpack that science a little bit and help us to understand the connection between all of these systems and the symptoms we associate with um, mental health challenges like depression, anxiety, brain fog, etc.
That was such a comprehensive overview. I feel I almost have nothing to say, which is rare for me. So I appreciate that very, very much. It's a wonderful, um, sort of foundational orientation towards a new kind of conversation. And I think it's perhaps my most important credential um, is that I myself put into remission an autoimmune condition that would otherwise have been chronic. So that stands as sort of the reason we're even having this conversation is that pivotal experience. It's also how I was open enough to consider, as a card-carrying, pill-pushing psychiatrist, Robert Whitaker's innovative and intrepid work. The only reason as a prescribing psychiatrist I would have ever even considered reading Anatomy of an Epidemic was because I had already uh, sort of raised some red flags around my conventional approach and education because it had me bumping up against the glass ceiling of what conventional medicine really had to offer through my own health experience.
Right,
Right.
right.
So I was diagnosed postpartum with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and I was at that time one of the first 300 what are called reproductive psychiatrists, which is a burgeoning specialty. This probably won't shock you, but it shocks many that there's such a thing as a specialist who is expert in prescribing to pregnant and breastfeeding women.
Mm,
So that's how much I believed in the pharmaceutical
right,
model that I
right.
actually thought, let me expose our most vulnerable,
Mm,
to these um, patentable chemicals because they are indicated, right? This is the only responsible way to meet the unfortunate challenges that genetics and bad luck and sort of wrong place, wrong time bring us, to encounter. And it was through, my sort of inbuilt skepticism around the capacity for conventional medicine to really offer me anything but a lifelong prescription myself
Hmm.
as a patient, which was interestingly the first time I'd ever really been a patient in my life, that I chose to go to a naturopath. And that was very unlike me. If you can't really imagine how unlike me that was at the time. And I look back and I thought, wow, I was really being led somewhere, beyond what I could have comprehended. Um, and I encountered a naturopath who was very science minded. This was very important because if she had been burning sage and,
Mm.
you know, with crystals and feathers hanging around, I would have turned around immediately.
Right,
But
right.
she is very academic woman, a very bright, and she really spoke to me in a language that was, my religion at the time. It's even called scientism for that reason. That it's an orientation towards science as being sort of the end of the conversation rather than a process.
Mhm.
And that, that attracted me, I guess, and opened
Right.
me. And it was through, my own work on myself and using lifestyle interventions like dietary change and exercise and, um, sort of educated consumerism around,
Mhm.
products and toxicant exposures, that I was able to see in black and white my own antibody numbers go from the high 2000s to normal. And I was able to see, for anyone who knows about this terminology, my TSH to go, into the normal range. And that really inspired me, but it also inspired a lot of anger in
Right,
me and sort of righteous rage, really, that I
right.
had never been taught in my very expensive, very stressful,
Mhm.
blood, sweat, and tears kind of a training,
Right,
that any of these factors were even relevant, let alone impactful, let alone, that remission was even really anything a patient could
right,
expect, let alone,
right.
consistently work towards. So that was my introduction to what is called psychoneuroimmunology, which is the catch-all term for what you were referring to. It's actually about 3 decades old, and many different people have been credited with its inception. One of the female researchers I like to reference is Candace Pert, who wrote a wonderful book called The Molecule of Emotion, but had many, many important credentials, including that she, worked at the NIH and discovered the opiate receptor, and very much helped us to understand that what we are calling emotions, right, we're calling these intangible, largely secondary artifacts of the human experience, are in fact encoded physiologically, and here's the peptides to prove it, and this is happening all throughout the body.
Mhm.
And this is very groundbreaking because otherwise we had been thinking about, sort of mind body very in a very Cartesian fashion, right? The legacy of Descartes, which is that the mind is kind of up here and the body's down there, and never the two shall meet, kind of a thing.
Mhm.
And in fact, when we look at published literature, research and otherwise, that tells a very different story
Mhm.
about the interconnectedness of these systems, well, then it kind of changes everything. Then
Mhm.
we have to rethink the way that we've been looking at allopathic medicine, which is go to your specialist, right? You go to your stomach doctor, your head doctor, your skin doctor,
Mhm.
and what happens when all of these are different, um, sort of strands on the spider web of you. And so through that lens, what's the highest impact way to realign, to restabilize? And it turns out that there isn't a magic pill, right? That there's not a chemical approach that can meet that level of complexity. And
Mhm.
that's why, sort of aligning with the ways in which we are designed to thrive, well, turns out that's more than just a wellness strategy. Turns out that may actually be the only way out of chronic illness. I could
Right,
elaborate
right,
however would help.
right. So, I mean, it's so fascinating that your kind of gateway to this new understanding, this new approach to treating women with mental health issues was through a thyroid autoimmune issue. And, that speaks so powerfully to the sort of integrative nature of health and mental health, as you were just stating. I'm kind of curious to know whether you yourself thought or whether you were diagnosed with postpartum depression before you got the proper um, diagnosis of Hashimoto's thyroiditis.
Yes, it's a great question because I have come to really deeply regard the significance of our childhood wounds, so to speak,
Mhm.
and our patterned and conditioned behavior from childhood in our manifest personality traits, but then also in our relationship to what we might call pathology, or the ways in which we are identified as patients. And the only difference between me and one of my severely ill patients is that I happen to have a defensive structure that's very adaptive, right? That society prizes the ways in which I have learned to protect my woundedness and vulnerability. And one of those ways is that I seek intellectual mastery, right? So whenever I feel vulnerable, scared, uncomfortable, anger, shame, you name it, the first thing I do is try to get an intellectual hold on
Mhm,
it, right?
mhm.
So that's what I did when I started to struggle with symptoms of brain fog and mood flatness and forgetfulness and feeling disconnected. That's a very, very big. Anyone who knows anything about postpartum depression, it's really almost a misnomer on some level because the flatness and disconnection is far more of a prevalent um, source of distress
Mm,
than angst or sadness or melancholy, right?
right.
And the only reason that I never got captured by the system is because I was able to defensively compensate, you know, through an obsessive process of learning about what was going on with me. And I am very comfortable
Yeah,
in the scientific realm. So that's
right.
what I did. And it's no coincidence, as you're pointing out, that I ended up learning a lot about the relevance of thyroiditis and thyroid imbalance to mental health and
Right.
specifically anxiety, depression, but even bipolar labels and specifically postpartum psychosis and
Right.
depression.
Right.
So I thought, well, look at this. I've had a lived experience of the relevance of an immunologically driven endocrine disturbance to the labeling of, psychiatric pathology, and that can't be an accident, right? That this is one of what I call the great psychiatric pretenders. That if you don't know that this could be relevant to your story, well, then you're essentially treating,
Right.
your Hashimoto's with Zoloft. And does that make any
Right.
sense to anyone?
Right. Right. And you do talk in your book about how common it is for women to experience some form of thyroid dysfunction following giving birth, um, because of many other factors that are stressing women's minds and bodies. And I'm curious to know how often you think um, a thyroid condition is misdiagnosed as
Mhm.
postpartum depression, whether that's a very common phenomenon.
So, statistically it ranges, but the most common statistic is about 10%
10%.
postpartum women.
Mhm.
And how they capture these statistics, who even knows?
Right.
But in my practice, it's about 80% of those who come to
Wow.
me postpartum have antibody activity. Now, what's interesting
Wow.
about the literature is that it suggests that simply antibody activity, like just autoimmune
Mhm.
activation or imbalance,
Right.
is significantly correlated clinically to the symptoms of depression and anxiety. Those are the most commonly studied, although there
Right.
are papers on diagnosis of bipolar and
Right.
psychosis. That's relevant, right? Because you don't have to. What if your doctor is just checking a TSH, which is the sort
Right.
of catch-all? Oh,
Right.
we've screened for hypothyroidism. You're
Mhm.
not going to see that this is a relevant driver for you.
Right.
And you know,
Right.
for many of us, understanding the why is
Mhm.
really important, right? Yes, the label can provide some relief, and many identified psychiatric patients will tell you, I felt better knowing that I had a problem, knowing that it was a
Mhm.
real problem, and somebody told me
Right.
that I had, postpartum OCD, or that I, I really do have postpartum depression and
Right.
don't understand what that means, and it's a real thing. And
Right.
yeah, what I would argue is that it's a bit of sort of like a cold comfort, right? Because
Right.
what comes with that, in my opinion, based on the literature, and there's only three to date randomized trials of antidepressants for postpartum depression, what we're calling postpartum depression. So this is, you're entering into the wild west
Mhm.
of clinical applications of
Right.
pharmaceutical products,
Right.
and with a population that I feel we should be really turning towards with a very different level of
Right.
regard.
Right. Absolutely. So what you're saying is, yes, there's comfort in being told, I recognize that you're suffering. I
Yes,
recognize that you're struggling and that something needs to be done. But the unfortunate aftermath of that is that the treatment will then be one of these handful of antidepressant medications that not only will not address the underlying issue, whether it be a thyroid issue or a psychological issue or a broader cultural issue,
yes,
um, so it then the woman who has this kind of brief sense of being seen and understood is given the wrong kind of treatment, which then exacerbates the issue. And I think this is especially relevant because of this very recent rollout of the latest drug for postpartum depression, brexanolone. I think the commercial name is Zulresso, and I have to say that I heard your video post about brexanolone. I thought it was outstanding. I thought that you addressed, some of the broader cultural, psychological, spiritual issues really, really beautifully. And I'm wondering if you could, speak to your concerns once again. Um, for us about this latest rollout of this very specific new drug for what is called postpartum depression.
yes, absolutely. It's something like when you were referring to the kind of help we're offering women. It's something like I use the analogy of, if she's falling off a cliff and you're handing her the blade edge of a knife,
Yeah,
like yeah, she can grab onto it, but is that really the best we can do? And
right,
I've come to appreciate the multifactorial vectors of why, and and to really ask that we as a culture, and that in these conversations like we're having right now, begin to explore with curiosity these whys, because we in the end as individuals are not served by even the best randomized trial. We are not served by statistics. We are not served by ICD-10 codes, and CPT numbering. In the end, we want to understand what is happening and why it's happening. And anything short of that is turning off the smoke alarm and letting the fire rage. And so the
right,
conversation that we might have around the whys of what we are calling postpartum depression is a conversation that really no one is having. No one seems interested in, because it's regarded as an urgent problem. And now, as you're suggesting, I think many women who have struggled feel like finally this is, being brought into the
right,
light. That's a good thing.
right,
And what many of us in our community have noted is that the moment that a diagnostic label is put forth as something to be destigmatized and celebrated, and it gets a day on the calendar, well, that's because there are vested interests looking to
mhm,
broaden their market share, right?
right,
It's not in the end a way to unravel what is happening for you.
mhm,
So, when I learned about brexanolone, which for those who don't know, is now slated to be FDA approved for postpartum depression. It is a 60-hour IV infusion,
mhm,
continuous, with side effects and adverse effects that include loss of consciousness.
Wow.
significant enough that it requires not necessarily inpatient, but it requires medical monitoring and separation of the mother from her infant, newborn,
Right.
so that she is not the primary caretaker for up to 7 to 10 days. And now, of course, at this very vulnerable time, that's a non trivial matter, especially because the breastfeeding data as it goes in this world is going to be insufficient to defend its safety. So it's likely going to be recommended that there be cessation of breastfeeding. Another interesting tidbit is that this medication has a price tag of $34,000,
Wow.
and all for what, right? So there were
Right.
274 women studied,
Wow.
and the outcomes. The reason it was a six, I don't know if it's necessarily the reason, but it certainly looks suspicious that it was a 60-hour intervention, is because that's when it separated from placebo in a fairly unimpressive way. If you know anything about the HAM-D or Irving Kirsch's work,
Mhm.
around placebo effects and
Mhm.
active placebo effects, and
Yeah. Of
injected anything has a very significant active placebo effect. And it,
course.
it does not separate from placebo at a month. So you're going to
Wow.
do all this for
Mhm.
what? Right?
Right. And do such harm to this, sensitive bond between mother and infant and disrupt the breastfeeding relationship and all of the health benefits that breastfeeding confers to mother and infant. It's really shocking. And you know that with that kind of price tag, it is going to be heavily marketed and defended. And the naysayers are going to be told, how could you,
Right.
how could you speak against this
Right.
saving grace for women who are suffering? And we just kind of know how it's going to get played out. And that's why I so appreciate you're just speaking with such candor about the science. The pseudoscience does not is with the the shoddy nature of the drug trial, um, not with the critique. So that's really problematic. I would also like to touch on another issue specific to women's mental health, and that is that in your book, Mind of Your Own, you cite that 1 in 4 women are prescribed an SSRI antidepressant. And, you were also, commenting that when you were practicing conventional psychiatry, you did often prescribe medication to women who were pregnant. And I'm wondering if you can speak to what your thoughts are today about the potential harms of women on SSRI antidepressants while pregnant, both to the mother and to the, prenatal development.
Yes, I can. As somebody who has very much lived, maybe more extremely than anyone else on the planet, prescribing in both camps,
Right.
I do have, I think, a unique perspective on that because I prescribed every day to pregnant when that was my specialty. That was the
Right.
population that I was focused on. My entire private practice was either
Wow.
preconception, pregnant, or postpartum.
Right.
And we had listen, the advisors and mentors that I had in that space actually helped me to appreciate how we can interact with scientific literature, because every new paper that would come out, and at that time there were only maybe a couple dozen, um, we would pick it apart and try to look at all its
Mm.
flaws, and I became, I think, quite like skilled at learning how to understand whether a paper is actually valuable or not. But the thing about science, right, and pseudoscience, is that you can arm yourself with science to defend any perspective. So in the end, you have to have, in my opinion, a more coherent, orientation towards your intentions, right? Like, what are we here to do? Are we here to simply mask symptoms, which in my perspective and opinion, as somebody very interested in the empowerment of women in the modern age, uh, I see masking of symptoms as a form of suppression, right? It's, we're not burning them at the stake, but
Right.
we're offering them a poison apple, right? And then we're sort of watching them go quietly into the corner and calling that, desired outcome. So we have to look at intentions, because if your intention is simply to generate an altered state, well, then, pharmaceuticals may be exactly what you want. They do that, not unlike, as David Healy would say, drinking vodka, for social anxiety would have the same, effect. Or Joanna Moncrief speaks to that too, like drug-based effects versus, sort of resolving disease level mechanisms, right? But, if your intention is to truly, get to the root and resolve and help a woman integrate what's going on, then even the question of applying medication doesn't come to bear. Right. So when I was prescribing, there was sort of a formula for how we would consent women. And, and that's also where I learned about informed consent, and what it consists of. So there are many things that I took from that training that still serve me to this day. And we would talk about a couple of things, right? We would talk about the data around preterm. Well, let's start in temporal order. So miscarriage, right? We would talk about the risk of primary pulmonary hypertension, which was a signal of harm that was normally or typically at that time raised around Paxil. We would look at preterm birth risk. We would look at what was euphemistically called, or is perhaps still, neonatal adaptation syndrome, which is a phenomenon in the baby that can happen shortly after birth. And then we would look at sort of some of the long-term studies. And we would try to ask, okay, so can we separate the impact of the disease, depression, let's say, if we're going to call it a disease, which we did, from the impact of medication? So that was always how we would look at the literature and try to see, okay, the signal of harm of medication relative to the signal of harm of untreated depression, which I guess means like do nothing, for this woman in distress. And what's surprising is that the signals of harm, according mostly to registry data, because remember, we don't study pregnant women in randomized trials. It's not done. It's not considered ethical. And so we don't have data on pretty much any interventions pharmaceutically that are offered to pregnant women. Remember that whenever there is a pharmaceutical product offered to you as a pregnant woman, know that it has not been subjected to even the most basic standards of scientific reasoning. So what do we use instead? We use registry data. So this is pharmaceutical companies largely, although Nordic countries have a lot of registry data too, but pharmaceutical companies that collect passive data, women who call in to report adverse effects. So this is like the quality of science we're talking about. But nonetheless, there is not really a significant teratogenic signal, which surprises me, right? Yeah. Considering what I know, having dedicated my practice to taking women off of these medications, I think of them as being the most powerfully habit-forming chemicals on the planet. So it does surprise me that isn't there.
Does that include premature birth, the teratogenic effect? Would that?
No.
So
it's like fingers, toes, organs.
Right.
It's in a different category.
And what's your impression of the sort of, I don't know, the risks of prematurity?
So the signal around miscarriage, teratogenicity, and prematurity really isn't that impressive, to be honest. It's really not where, in my opinion, knowing epigenetics, for example, I'm assuming most people have heard this term at this point, even 10 years ago, was not really in allopathia. Okay. So I didn't know that term. I didn't know what it meant. We weren't looking at epigenetic research. We were looking at these crude outcomes. And according to most of these crude outcomes, apart from neonatal adaptation syndrome, which at the time we didn't know whether it was toxicity or withdrawal. Of course, they're two sides of the same coin. But nonetheless, the question was, is the baby being exposed to high levels of medication at parturition that it can't metabolize, with its infant liver, or is it actually in withdrawal? We didn't know one way or the other, and arguably we still don't know, although what I now know about withdrawal seems far more likely that that's the case. And so these babies can require ICU stays is about 30% of cases. But we were really taught to say things like, well, It's very rare that it requires an ICU stay, and
Mhm.
it's self-limiting, right? So it's spontaneously resolves, and it's kind of like a don't worry about it.
Mhm.
But now
Even though,
knowing,
in fact, the numbers are 30%.
yeah, it's not
Mhm.
infrequent, right? Which
Right,
probably anyone who knows about withdrawal wouldn't be
right.
surprised to hear that, right? Because even in
Mhm.
the literature, the
Right,
growing withdrawal literature, there's
right.
only about 50% of people who
Mhm.
actually have significant
Mhm.
withdrawal. So that kind of makes sense.
Right.
But then I started to look into the epigenetic literature, literature about methylation, literature about effects on the microbiome, and even effects on telomeres and different
Mm.
sorts of more subtle impact
Mhm.
on the cortisol receptors.
Mhm.
What are these medications doing?
Mhm.
Um, in terms of in utero exposure, and then let alone breastfeeding, et cetera. But
Right.
the questions are just not even remotely answered, right? There are a couple of researchers, maybe there's, I could show you 7 papers
Mhm.
that have begun to explore the epigenetic impact, right? So what
Right.
happens? We know, again, in Whitaker's community now, thankfully, we know that long-term exposures, even medium-term exposures, have unintended consequences in a very unpredictable way.
Right.
So would that
Right.
not be the case
Right.
for a newly forming human whose
Right.
template of biology is being set
Right.
at this
Right.
time? And
Absolutely.
how are we going to monitor that, right? Because
Right.
then you have a baby born, with measurable toxicant exposure in the umbilical cord.
Right. Right.
They're, exposed to all sorts of different pharmaceutical products, injected
Mhm.
and otherwise. They are, fed formula. They're drinking fluoride. The
Mhm.
EMFs everywhere, and then you're
Right.
going to check whether or
And
not
then
they have normal neurodevelopment at age 9. It's like
right.
the signal to
Why
noise
would we
ratio
wanna
is not.
add right. Why would
But
we
we
wanna
can't even
add to
answer the
that burden?
question, right?
Mhm.
So we'll not.
Right.
I'm skeptical that we can ever really,
Right.
at this point, answer the
Right.
question of are
Right.
these safe? Um, you know,
Right. So
for
we
for
want to exercise the precautionary principle. Since we can't know and we have reason to fear that they're not safe, why would we introduce a fetus to an antidepressant? So, what do you recommend to women who perhaps come into your practice on an antidepressant, who are already pregnant or wanting to get pregnant, and have very valid concerns about challenging withdrawal effects? How do you address that?
Yeah. So I've noted over the years, again, having a lot of exposure to this population, that pregnancy is the easiest time to withdraw from psychotropics.
Interesting.
Period. I, if I knew why that was, I would have the magic bullet for easing
That's so
withdrawal,
interesting.
which I do not,
Mhm.
um, because I have noted that a taper that might otherwise take 9 months or 18 months, can be done in the space of 2 months in the pregnant state. Now, I imagine if
Right.
I were to theorize, that has something to do with cortisol levels, that has something to do with the sort of neuroendocrine milieu of pregnancy that is highly unique.
Right.
And it's, for whatever reason, conducive to a level of resiliency that is not available even to the same woman at another time in her lifespan. So I am an advocate for um, rapid tapers during pregnancy, mostly because I find that they're sustainable and very,
Right.
very doable. Um, and I still feel that the upfront investment, which I apply to every person, every patient I
Mhm.
encounter, of sending this sort of what I call a signal of safety from many, many different directions, physiologically, psychologically, and arguably even spiritually, in terms of self empowerment, self reclamation,
Mhm.
which is basically this 1 month protocol of lifestyle medicine. I still think that is an important upfront step before
Mhm.
tapering, even in pregnancy. And the beauty of that intervention is it's not a Sophie's choice like it was for me when I would prescribe, Zoloft to a pregnant patient. I'd have to think, oh, is this maybe not best for the baby, but it's best for the
Mm.
mom, and to this whole
Mhm.
thing.
Right.
These kinds of lifestyle interventions, they're good for everyone involved, so there's
Right. Right.
only benefit and side benefit.
Okay. So in other words, you do the kind of the 1 month protocol that you describe in your book and on your website, and then you taper the pregnant, or you
Yes.
rapidly taper her perhaps through that 1 month protocol. I want to I want to talk a little bit about the protocol, because there's a kind of a wonderful, elegant, intuitive quality to all of the recommendations that you make. You um, tell people to stop eating junk food and
Right.
processed
Not
food,
rocket
and
science.
it's not right, but it's
No.
it's so wonderfully intuitive. Eat real food, preferably organic, so you're not consuming pesticides. Prioritize sleep, moderate exercise. Get Stop putting toxic chemicals on your body in terms of self care products, and stop using toxic chemicals in your cleaning products. Um, Lower EMF and blue light exposure, learn how to relax through meditation and breathing exercises, limit or eliminate pharmaceuticals. It's all kind of, yeah, like, of course, why wouldn't we be doing this? And yet we live in a culture that makes it so difficult for us to do these, intuitively healthy to make these intuitively healthy choices. And I imagine for a lot of your patients, it's hugely challenging, because it's basically you're telling them to change pretty much every aspect of their lifestyle. And so I guess I'm curious to know, do you kind of approach on all fronts? Do you feel that it's important to do all of the above all at once? Or do you kind of, is there an entry point? What's your experience and your recommendation?
One of the reasons that I, sort of believe so passionately in the power of these lifestyle changes, and I'll answer your question more directly in a moment,
Sure.
is that the women who have come to me in private practice, unfortunately, I'm not their first stop, right? I am more often than not the last stop, like
Mhm.
just before state hospital, just before electroconvulsive therapy, or
Mhm.
after, 25 years on 5 medications, chronically suicidal, multiple inpatient stays. And it's sort of, there's a level of desperation in nearly every woman that I encounter for consultation that is palpable, And so they are extremely motivated, right? They're
They're ready to do the
extremely
work.
ready.
Yeah.
And so that's how I've been able to witness the magnitude of change, and to counter the frequent criticism I encounter, which is that this is just oh sure, this is for the worried well, this is for,
Mhm.
yeah, if you want to like a little blog worthy wellness tips, sure.
Right.
Actually, I have an entire clinical team of people devoted to writing up these cases, because
Mhm.
they're, in my opinion, as far as I know, what's on pubmed.gov, they're history making, they're precedent making.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's what can come from these changes. Now,
Right.
the the fierce commitment, the uncomfortable commitment to oneself, you could go from popping a couple pills a day and, otherwise just like kind of drowning in your life, to go from that to about 2.5 hours of self-care demands a day is a major shift. Well, that's actually one of, in my opinion, the ways that our nervous system gets the sign and signal that change is possible. Right?
Mhm.
That's the way that we clear the snow so you can, sort of ski new tracks,
Right.
because otherwise you're going to slip into your little rut. So
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in the extreme approach. It's
Right.
1 month of your life. It's
Right.
1 month of your adult life.
After oftentimes years of suffering.
Yes,
Right.
almost
Right.
always, right? And
Right.
and it's kind of like the ultimate self experiment.
Mhm.
Under these conditions, who are you?
Mhm.
Right? Under these
Right.
baseline conditions, don't you
Right.
want to know? Right? So you
Yeah.
need to have a certain level of readiness, which is this elusive ingredient that I cannot induce, I cannot persuade,
Right.
and it's not for everyone.
Right.
I have you know a large subscribership, and a very small percentage of those people have participated in my online program.
Right.
It's a level of readiness that requires a confrontation with parts of yourself that you need to be ready and courageous enough to defy. Because
Right.
most of our programming says what? It says, you're not good enough, you're not worth it, it's not going to work for you, this
Right.
is your life. And the
Right.
chief statement that I hear from almost everyone is, I'm broken, right? I'm broken.
Right. Well, that's the
This is my
chemical
lot.
imbalance theory. That's,
Yeah,
what culture has been telling you, that you've got a broken brain, it's genetically informed, you need a medication, you're sick, you have a
that's right.
diagnosis. And so it takes it has taken you great courage to step out of the kind of medical training that were informed by to embrace this new approach. And it takes the average person great courage to say, no, I'm going to try this other thing because this speaks to me. This sounds right to me. This science and this approach and this um, just philosophy of life feels right to me.
And that's what I have witnessed, is that I'm not convincing anyone. In fact, what happens is there's like a little flicker inside of, the people who decide to walk this path. And I think this would be true of anyone who's tapered off psychiatric medications. I
Right,
think they would agree. It's a
right,
tiny flicker, and someone, just sort of saw it. And perhaps these cases that someone is me, where I see that that flicker is there, and I'm just reminding, people that
right,
they have this capacity. So, I am my personality is oriented, towards sort of like, take the plunge and do it, like grab it,
right, right.
and we are about to release a membership model, called Vital Life Project, which is like the more feminine offering that I haven't yet made. I think of Vital Mind Reset as like my masculine offering. It's like, do it, fix yourself. Kind of, here's your tools. Do it or go home.
Yeah,
And that's not for everyone, right?
mm,
So what if you just can't get there? What if you're interested, you feel a yes inside, you
right,
want to sort of like begin this process, but you're terrified, and you need a small win, like you need a quick win. Um, and so that's what I'm realizing, like, if I want to really support a broader mass of people, if we
right,
want to really keep this light bright for this movement,
right,
then we need to meet people where they are with like these
right,
sort of smaller bites.
right. So what you're saying is that if you want a profound change very quickly, you really need to take on every tenet collectively because they will reinforce each other, they work in an integrative way, and you will see profound change in a month.
Yes.
If for any number of reasons that's not something that you're able to take on, you're sort of offering this kind of gentler, slower approach as an alternative so that um, that would be another way to go about it. I have a very kind of specific question. Do you find that for those individuals who kind of take on the whole package and really commit to the food, the sleep, the exercise, the toxic, getting rid of all the toxins in their homes and on their bodies and the whole 9 yards, that they are also able to taper more quickly from their
Mm.
medication, that it has a kind of a synergistic benefit to tapering, or do you still kind of keep the taper very, very slow?
That's a great question that I'm unfortunately very able to answer because I had 5 years of doing tape. So it was basically after, yeah, after I read Anatomy of an Epidemic, I never started a patient on a prescription medication again, to
That's
this day.
amazing.
Never did. Put down my pad. I'm done.
Right,
And I devoted myself to supporting tapers and also, some autoimmune support, et cetera, other things. But that was my specific orientation. So I hadn't really understood the applicability of my experience with Hashimoto's to my patients yet. It wasn't clear. I didn't have a protocol or any of that. I knew, yeah, you might think about like, your diet. It was kind of like a window dressing to the taper. That's what we're here for, is the taper, right?
Mhm.
And and so I had a lot of years of trying to taper without this upfront commitment. And oh my, ask anyone in my life what a nightmare it was for me. I was running an outpatient rehab, it felt like. I was paged around the clock. I
Yeah,
was filling out
yeah.
medical disability forms left and right. I was so overwhelmed by the tragedies in my midst. It's just incredible. I mean, literally, it looks like I was running an AIDS clinic. And anyone who's had a bad taper experience will know what I'm talking about. That you literally can be physically disabled to an extent that is unparalleled.
Right.
In any sort of acute medical condition that we know about, maybe you're short of an acquired acute immunodeficiency.
Mm.
Bleeding and intractable pain and inability to move and hair loss
Wow.
and menstrual
Wow.
aberration. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
unbelievable. And so
Right.
once I sort of got straight with this,
Mhm.
I am serious about it, and really had like a no compromising kind of orientation towards it. That's when I saw the difference. So now, not only is it that tapers are more rapid, and the
Mhm.
introduction of the notorious coffee enema actually to my practice protocol, which I learned from my mentor, Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez,
Mhm.
then brought it another quantum leap.
Okay.
But for me, it's really what I feel is available to everyone is a physiologic stabilization, right? So if you can balance your blood sugar, you can reverse some of your toxicant burden, you can support your own detox capacity, you can eat a more nutrient rich diet, which then will go on to stabilize all of your biochemical functioning as a human organism.
Mhm.
And then you're applying the stress of a physiologic stress of a taper. It's just like the bucket analogy, right? If you're going to
Mhm.
drain your bucket, then when you
Mhm.
fill it up with the stress of a taper, it's not going to overflow.
Mhm.
Now, what I find is that the psychospiritual aspects that are very real, very real. You have to birth your adult self
Mhm.
from beginning of taper to end of taper. And so maybe that's part of why these tapers take the time that they do, because that process is a it's a metaphysical process, right? That requires the addressing of a lot of inbuilt um, and learned patterns that are no longer serving you, right? So you essentially have to go from a dependent victim, which, as you've alluded to, we are enculturated to orient, towards. We kind of want to, because we're still living from our child selves, right? We still are holding that like feeling that we haven't been acknowledged for our
Right.
suffering, right?
Right.
That we weren't loved completely or attended
Right.
to unconditionally, right? So you have to go from that to
Right.
an emancipated and empowered, individuated adult consciousness in the space of your taper. That's literally the
Right.
ask. And if that doesn't interest you, you should not consider tapering medication,
Mhm.
because this is not just about, oh, I don't feel like paying for my Prozac anymore, or my
Mhm.
Lamictal or Abilify.
Mhm.
This is literally that important, an
Right.
initiation to oneself. So can we keep your physical health stable throughout that process? That's pretty much
Right.
like what I offer. And then, of course, sort of orienting towards um, the power, meaning, and even beauty of this emergent shadow material, and metabolizing this, sort of inner
Right.
darkness. Like I do
Right.
believe passionately in that. But that's
Mhm.
really the difference of this protocol, is it offers that physical foundation.
That physical foundation. And so I think that some of some of the language and some of the, thoughts that you just sort of added to the conversation kind of dovetail very well with my next question. And that is that several of the items on your kind of 1 month protocol lend themselves, translate very well to a kind of a Western science culture, a Western science kind of
Mhm.
worldview. We can understand the science of eating real food and the science of the harms that pesticides cause. We can understand the science of sleep and the science of exercise. But the sort of the one tenet um, that you describe as just absolutely it's a non-negotiable is meditation.
Hmm.
And that is sort of the one tenet that doesn't translate quite so readily or fully to the kind of Western science orientation. Okay, well, here's the science. Here's what medication is. What meditation is. That was an interesting slip.
I
Here's
do
what.
that all the time. Isn't that a funny? Yeah, it's like,
Oh,
what?
wow. Here's the real science behind meditation. We can kind of just break it down to the science, but it doesn't fully digest. It doesn't fully absorb into just kind of
I
scientific
don't know. I don't
principles. Or do you
know.
think that it
Yeah,
does?
I do actually.
Uh-huh.
And the reason that I know a lot of the pre-existing science, much of which is out of the Benson Institute, it's like 40 years of it, is because I was aware of all of this science. A lot of it is epigenetic, like looking at expression of like, um, you know, uh, insulin receptor sensitivity and different sort of parameters of inflammatory cytokine expression in like 20 minutes of exposure to a guided meditation. So it's the most passive, effortless like form of
Right.
meditation. We're not talking about like, high levels of transcendental practice or anything.
Mhm.
I knew about this literature way before I personally committed. Meditation was the last thing I committed to. And I often joke the people who are most resistant to meditating are the ones who need it the most. I certainly fit that category. And I just couldn't, I wasn't desperate enough, to be honest, and it wasn't until actually my mentor very suddenly died in 2015 that I committed the next day to a pre-dawn meditation practice that has changed my life, that I haven't missed a day since. But I couldn't
Can you,
quite. Mhm.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say I couldn't quite be persuaded by the existing literature, and
Okay.
it is there,
Mhm.
and like I don't personally practice TM, like transcendental meditation, but I mean, there's incredible wealth of really high level research to
Right.
support that.
Right.
I
So
and
it does
Yeah,
translate to
it
Western
does.
science. Mhm.
It does, and even
Right.
my preferred form, which is
Mhm.
I'm trained in Kundalini yoga
Mhm.
and meditation, and once I began to feel the effects, benefits, influence of this kind of approach to meditation, and it's one of the more ancient forms of meditation, and it involves often like a mantra and a mudra. It's like a hand gesture of some kind, or even a movement. Sometimes there's a movement of your body, and then sometimes there's a eye gaze that you're supposed to have, like looking down here or up there. It keeps you very busy, so it's very amenable to the novice, like to somebody who is otherwise going to be thinking about what they need to buy at the sort of grocery store instead of focusing on 0 point consciousness. It helps. It's like a lot of crutches, right, to sort of keep you
Right.
busy in a way,
Right.
distracted from your sort of stream of thoughts. But I remember, coming across the this one particular study by David Shenoff Kalsa, who's a friend and wonderful person, and he showed me it was like a 70% remission rate for symptoms of OCD. You show
Wow.
me one
That's
pharmaceutical product
amazing.
with that remission rate.
That's
I mean, the best we could do
incredible.
is like
Yeah.
23%. And it
Right.
was, I wrote this up. This is a blog that lives on my site, and this was a Kundalini yoga meditation intervention. And
Wow.
so I thought, okay, this is a randomized trial,
Mhm.
and I never heard about this in my medical training. I should have at least heard about it, even if they were
Right.
to, dismiss it or debunk it. But that's
Sure.
also when I started to appreciate, wow, I really was only exposed to one,
Mhm.
version of the
Right.
story. So the science
Right.
absolutely exists.
Right.
It's just no one has specified which form is best, not
Mhm.
unlike diet. No one has specified how
Right.
long you need to meditate or in what
Right.
seated position or standing or walking or whatever.
Right.
But what we do know is that there are these sort of lifestyle interventions that have the capacity to rearrange many different um, markers of internal imbalance. Of course, the most popular form of research is around cytokines, so inflammatory markers and messengers, although there are others. Um, and we can see in real time, that these interventions have physiologically measurable
Mhm.
impact.
Right. So I'm curious to know, you said that, that was the sort of the one piece that you were resistant to, so that even though you were familiar with the science, you understood that it translated well
Yes,
into science, that there was still a kind of a skeptic within you that
always,
took
yes.
a moment before or it took a great loss to kind of say, yes, I need to do this. I need to add this to my health regimen.
Yes.
And you said that it made a great difference for you, and I'm wondering if it's something that is describable,
Oh,
how
yeah.
it shifted your sense of wellness, after adding a meditation practice.
Absolutely. I mean, I had tried meditating, here and there. In fact, I did an entire training. It's just the consistency was never available to me. I always had some excuse and there was always some reason I never could sort of work it into a routine. So
Mhm,
once I committed, it was about 2 months um, before I literally felt rewired as a person. And
wow.
I'm sure many can, identify with how I would have described myself, which was I was a stress addict. I was somebody who was up late into the night, working and a workaholic, working almost sort of scanning my life constantly for the things to worry about, the things that I would agitate myself about, or sort of like put my mind towards fixing and solving. And I would often get triggered, so I would get like racing heart and sweating and an urgent feeling like I had to do something like by email communication. So interpersonal relationships always felt like a landmine of potential problems I had to, impose myself upon. Um, and and I literally in the space of those 2 months broke my relationship to stress.
That's
So that I
incredible.
can say from that point on,
Mhm,
I do not I can't even remember the last time I said I'm stressed out.
mhm.
Literally, it's been years. And that is not because I have a placid lake of a life. Okay. So nothing, arguably things have even gotten more intense and challenging and more, deeply challenging since, 2015, let's say. But it's my sense of, I don't know, capacity to it's almost like my nervous system is saying, we've got this. We've got this. It's always saying that. We've got this. Whatever it is, bring it. We've got it. It's
Wow.
a sense of being able to receive I'm experiencing without having to just always have like, oh no, 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 like that feeling.
Yeah.
And I actually think that the pre-dawn element, unfortunately, was a big part of it for me because I started to wake up at 5:30, which meant that I couldn't go to bed at 2 a.m. anymore, which changed my whole circadian rhythm.
Right.
And now these days I go to bed at 9 o'clock with my daughters. So I have a very, very different lifestyle than I did, back in the day in Manhattan. Um, but so who knows, which elements of that. And I even did some research to try and find out, well, what is it about pre-dawn contemplation? Because many, from mystical traditions to religious traditions, prize this ambrosial, it's called, like hour of about 40 minutes before sunrise. And I found that actually nomadic, there's some research, mostly anthropological, but nomadic tribes, they don't wake up. Wouldn't you think they wake up with the sunrise? Like that's what I would
Yes.
imagine.
Yes.
And in fact, they wake up at the coldest point of the night, which is 40 minutes before sunrise. So that
Wow.
there's something very special about that time. And I remember even as a medical intern, that's when people cross over. That's when people die, is like between 4 and 6 a.m. And yes, you could offer some endocrinologic explanations for that, et cetera. But it's like regarded by many different, traditions as being a very like a time that the veil is very thin. And so, to sort of begin your day, put a stamp on your rising cortisol that says everything is okay. Because if it wasn't, you wouldn't pause, right? And that's why I'm such a believer in the daily commitment, where I say, like, literally, it can be 3 minutes, but do not miss a day ever.
Right.
Because
Right.
it's in that consistent signal that your nervous system finally can move into regeneration and out of fight or flight.
Well, that was just completely fascinating. What a wonderful and innovative note to finish on. And I am so grateful that you gave us an hour of your time and your
Thank you.
wisdom. It was really, really wonderful to speak with you, and I hope we have an opportunity to speak again.
I loved your questions. This was really, really enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.